really talked here about the fact that we should design buildings which don't collapse. And what you are talking about, I don't think we have to talk about.
Schlock architects are putting up schlock buildings every day that leak all over the place, and we're trying to be sensitive to the issues at all.
Well, go get them, man.
What about your air-conditioned mall for Santa Monica?
What about it?
Well, I mean, all right, you want us to go get you, or, I mean, how to...
Another question? Wait, let me see if there's one in the back.
Why is it then? How come there is no committee form? You don't seem to come together to even discuss these problems so that you can do something about them. There is no political astuteness. I've been downtown. I've heard the Regional Planning Commission make horrible mistake after another, and all these horrible decisions that are being made by people who don't have any knowledge of architecture, any expertise whatsoever, and yet you're doing nothing about it on a political level. Nothing. I mean, not even the students have formed a committee and decided if you wanted to change the code, what you'd like to change them to. Is there anybody at all who has formed a committee who, is trying to do something of a practical nature?
Anybody want to respond to that? Anybody want to take that one?
I'll talk about
You're,
it.
of course, talking to a set of teachers who spend their entire lives on committees. The thought of one more is enough to drive me out of my head.
I think you're right. I just, on all aspects. And whether, I don't know, you want to get together? I had an experience last spring where they were doing something up on Mulholland where I guess this project had 23 denials or something, some proposal for a high-rise to begin with, and finally kept drooping and finally got down to a rather low level. And going down to the meeting, and Susan Nelson asked me to speak, and it was almost all, it was like a stage. I mean, everything was set up, the rules were already determined, who was going to listen to who, and what the decision at the end would be. And there was a lot of resistance and so on, all these committees and groups and all. And at the end, they took a vote. It was all for the development. They walked away. I mean, I'm not sure. I think maybe a little revolution might be good, yeah.
Another question? Yes.
I came here specifically because I couldn't figure out why actually these people were asked to be on the committee except Glenn, because none of them are considered architects. Glenn, I think, everybody on all these people are like World War I. This sounds nebulous. I'd like to use a particular example of one person on the panel. I think one of the worst pieces of architecture I've ever seen, and ironically it won an award, is Frank Gehry's house for Ron Davis. This thing disputes every possible aspect of the site, of the materials, of the potential of the energy, and has absolutely nothing still environment that blows out the windows. So I think you're an amazing. I really don't think you can stand up to it. I've seen your 200 outside website for the president of the Intel Toys. That's just amazing. That you even actually accept the project, and you put the time into the project, and you waste the money. Well, no, I wanted to keep it going. Yes, I have. I know it's getting very well. I happen to be an artist myself. And I just wonder, I haven't heard anything about this particular architecture. Well, Glenn Small decided to depart from that and become paper configuration. Because the idea is that he has to work on it at that level, because it has to become, when it's being a political process, and it has nothing much to do with concrete and more steel, and things like that. That's what I'm just trying to say.
Are there any other questions?
I'd just like to ask, how do you live in a role of 2008?
Do you want me to help you live in something else? I mean, here I am. I'm available. I'm willing to implement all this. And just give me the bucks, man.
Steve?
I would like to ask, there was a remark made by Glenn in his opening remarks about hard edge spaces being psychologically destructive. And what I've been thinking about a great deal is, how does one know that? As architects, the group that we're listening to, how do you know that?
Listen.
Are you inferring that a space by Mr. Moore is hard edge and therefore psychologically destructive, and somehow by some illusion of softening that edge, that it's less psychologically destructive? I just don't understand those kinds of connections. And I, like perhaps the rest of you, try and make that kind of connection, especially make that kind of connection in terms of what kind of expertise the architect has to make that connection in the first place.
All right. You want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's quite evident psychologically when you're in certain spaces. Say when you're around situations like this, and so on, that your subconscious is basically on guard against these edges. And if you start to slip or anything like that, you can hear your whole system going into action. You're slipping, you're falling, you're going to hurt yourself, watch out for your hands, and you've all experienced this sort of thing. And yet when you get in other spaces like a sandy beach, or a very lush meadow, or a situation like a bed, a very large bed and so on, and pillows and all this sort of thing, that your whole system starts to come down. There's a certain amount of relaxation and easing of tension and so on. And I think also these hard edges are dangerous. I think also in nature, in talking about in another aspect of just physical form, in terms of the visual aspects, that continually in nature uses forms that you almost can read the structure inherently, and it is hardly ever one where it's very, very boxy per se, but it's more of one that's fanning out or really following a backbone or something like this. And I find these things, it might be a personal taste, but I find these things terribly exciting, like being in a ship's hull and seeing all the lattice work and all that's coming off of it in a very, very strong way, and it's all doing something structurally, and there's sort of a total inherent quality about it. But yet when I get in, say, a plastered room, and where I can't see anything, I don't feel anything, I know that I can't hit these things without them hitting back. and so on, I find this terribly negative. And I think probably if you ran a series of tests, and these have been done with monkeys and so on, and grabbing something hard and grabbing something soft, that they migrate to the one that's soft and so on, that there's certain inherent qualities that we feel more comfortable with these things.
And don't you think that this is a little bit too generalized? Don't you think that for certain functions or certain activities it's nice to have soft surfaces, and for others you would like to have hard surfaces? I would like to see me walk all day long on a waterbed, for instance, and to carry things down the beach is sometimes very...
Yeah, but you could walk on a thing like grass and it wouldn't be such a bad thing, right?
Yeah, but that's not quite as soft.
Pardon?
So you come much closer to a hard surface. And I think it's very dangerous to make such black and white generalizations. If you would try to analyze each material or each situation in relation to what it is serving, you probably wouldn't come up with such extreme argument.
All right, what are we serving? I mean, are we serving this sort of animal, which is ourself? I think we've had a tendency to get further and further away from our natural habitat. And I guess one example, I was out with some students one day and we were looking over a site and we were going over a very steep crevice and so on. And suddenly I had to take my hands and I had to dig them into the soil. And I suddenly discovered that the dirt was going under my fingernails and so on, and there was a sensation that was being derived, and it was almost like a recall, like this is maybe what my hand was designed to do or something. And I think probably we could start to think about this in a lot of aspects, like swinging, jumping, tumbling, all these things that we do when we get drunk or intoxicated and so on. That maybe they're innate aspects of our nature that we haven't even started to consider because we've been too busy maybe making very efficient floors to run the carpet sweeper or clean up the mess or whatever it is. And I think we've come to an age where we can start thinking beyond these. And I agree with you. Obviously, it'd be very hard to roller skate on a spongy mattress or something. But I mean, for certain activities, certain things do require harder edges and so on. But I think it's a really neglected aspect of our physical environment.
Again, with your dirty fingernails, I think it's nice from time to time. I built this house which I showed with my own hands, and I hated to have always my dirt and the concrete and everything under my fingernails. And so I think, again, to put it up as a black and white situation, sometimes it may be nice and sometimes it may be not, and that's what makes our environment exciting. If we would say, only rectangular angles are allowed and only soft surfaces are allowed, we would make a terrible mistake.
I think innately in our society already we've delegated people to hard edges. I mean, I don't even think there's a soft edge principle being applied at all. And all I'm saying, let's experiment with it, and we might find that it has psychological effects that are beneficial. I mean, you seem to be defending something that there isn't even a movement.
I have a tiny personal anecdote. I built a house for myself, which appeared in one of those slides 15 years ago, which was square. And a student built a thesis in the yard, which was all soft surfaces. And the people I sold the house to 11 years ago are adding on to the square house now, thus tearing down the soft round house, which they discover they don't go into because it disorients them and makes them uneasy.
Maybe those were square people. I saw both houses. I went there and I saw them way back when I was living in San Francisco. And I guess I really related to the other one. I thought the other one was totally out of scale, though, in terms of human beings. It could be a little larger and be a lot more livable, and there wasn't any functional aspect in it to warrant anybody staying in there for any length of time and so on.
One last question.
Well, I just want to say that the real thrust of the question, if I might, is what is it that is in your expertise? What is it that's in your knowledge, that gives you the ability or the right to make that kind of decision? Are you speculating? Do you have an insight? If you have an insight, then do you have a belief about how people live that translates into your work? I mean, how firm is this?
Well, everything I've drawn or designed has a lot of these things that I've been talking about. And I always hear this put up or shut up type of argument, and it's like, it's almost like driving you into your backyard to finally do it, and it's going to be just your personal little thing, and that's the stage I'm at now.
No, I don't mean the put up kind of, shut up kind of thing. I mean, what is it with the panel as a whole, that enables one to make a decision? We've talked about diversity and complexity. To make that kind of decision, that perhaps a historical illusion is a more psychologically, I think I heard it Mr. Moore the historical illusion perhaps is a more psychologically accommodating phenomenon in the spatial world, the physical world. There's a big jump between that and one small statement, and I just wonder, what is it, for example, that gives Mr. Moore the assurance that a historical illusion will give a more psychologically comforting response and therefore is a direction that perhaps is sustainable in the future?
It's pretty clear that the literature in our field is not adequate to make a set of judgments out of books. For instance, we can't read exactly how people will react to things and know that we must make a shape of a certain sort. And so I think what each of us has to do is to proceed with his best judgment at any given point in very close connection with the people who are meant to use the thing in question. One of the things I didn't talk about in opening remarks and had meant to was it seems to me that building houses or any kind of buildings is a matter of much more of energy and of the collection of energy than of style or shape. That what needs to happen for any good house, and I mean apartment or whatever, wherever, any good dwelling, is, I believe, that the energies of the inhabitant, as well as the energies of the designer and the builder and anybody else who is involved, have to be collected in some way that does involve all these people, and that the success of the matter is a success of collecting energy. Most of the things that surround us are not good enough because they don't have enough care in them. And I think when the people involved are, and the people who are going to live there are involved, obviously that's harder in public housing than it is in an individual house, then comes the chance to ask them, of course, rather than tell them, and see what they like, what they think they'll feel good with, what they don't like. Then comes the further chance, when it gets built, to see whether they're still friendly or whether they announce that very serious mistakes have been made and call up at 4 o'clock in the morning shouting. And I think that obviously this is a sort of low-grade human process that you have to gather experience, so what amounts to painfully, but it's the only way I know about that seems to work. The attempts that I've watched and helped with a little bit in the last 20 years to put together a literature have not been, in our field, very, very successful or very complete.
And in response to your question, I get the feeling that what you try to say is that we shouldn't do anything unless we are 100% sure that what we are doing is correct. We probably all have to admit that we don't know very much, But anyway, we are going ahead and doing something, and we have one thing in our favor, that people for whom we build are different, and no matter what you build, you will always probably find people who will enjoy no matter what you do. And there is no correct, or there is no one single correct solution. And therefore, we can be very happy that we don't have to know everything for sure before we do. Otherwise, if we had your attitude, we wouldn't be able to do anything.
I think that's a nice positive note to end on this evening. I want to thank our distinguished panel for coming and sharing their thoughts with us this evening, and thank you all for coming. Those of you who would like to be on our mailing list for future events, please, I think there's a sign-up sheet on the back desk. Thank you again.
Analog of the infrastructure and let people then arrange it according to their demands. I think that would be an ideal state. But since it doesn't exist, I don't know what the answer is. It isn't satisfactory to have a large organization making decisions for a lot of people. That takes the form of urban renewal on one hand. It takes the form of a developer building a tract or a 200-unit condominium. And even with the best of architects, that whole sort of thing is normally doomed to failure because there isn't any room for an individual's own impingement on the end result. And obviously, we have a society that attempts to make people feel incompetent. I'm getting this from psychologists, since architects don't like to think about it. But the whole building industry is part of that. Everything has been overcomplicated, so people feel they have no control over their environment, whether it's fixing a washing machine that breaks down or somehow being able to rearrange their living and office space. And, excuse me?
Do you think that's true in terms of the just proliferation of manuals and magazines and supplements that encourage you to do it yourself and remodel it yourself and fix it yourself and all those kinds of things?
But that's not really the dominant direction of society.
Wouldn't you say that that's one of the contributing factors to 80% of what you call architecture being done by people that are other than architects?
No, those people have usually some sort of technical training to do it. They're engineers or they're architects in some form, but not really architects in the full sense of the word. They're building technicians, and that 80% isn't done by people who add a room onto their house. But I think if people had a greater sense of their own competence in that area, and if there was a different, let's say a legal system, building codes, one of the purposes of building codes is to assure a market or employment for certain kinds of professionals, whether they're professional plumbers or professional designers or at least a structural engineer to stamp the drawings. But I think our society has over-specialized itself, and the very fact that people don't plug into the process is a problem, and I don't see how they can, the way it's set up.
To answer that question, within the context of Los Angeles, that question, I think in some places, I mean, it would be just totally academic to even ask a question like that. I mean, in some cities, I think in New York, no one's going to design a house or a building in New York, I mean, because, you know, it's got to be at least 60 stories or 70 stories. And I think in some ways, Los Angeles is a kind of a place where an individual can build a house if he wants to. I mean, even with a minimum of education, you can go up and score a piece of property in Topanga Canyon, you know, and build a teepee or whatever you want to build almost. You could take several years to build a dome or not only just the design of houses or your own thing. I think right near here, not 2 blocks away, is a sort of a great piece of sculpture that a garbage man did. It's just, well, it is a big American flag hanging by a freeway. But, I mean, it's some guy decided, well, he wants to see a lot of patriotic color in the sky at this point, and he has a pole, and he puts up this flag, and it's like to my feeling, it's a work of sculpture. I mean, just as much as Andy Warhol's big soup can was a work of art. But, you know, and basically about the chaos, you know, you're worried about the chaos. Well, everybody's worried about the chaos. And I think that, you know, when I first decided that I really hadn't essentially learned anything in architecture school, what I didn't learn was, well, they warned us. They said, well, the problem with being a great architect and designing fantastic gems is you can't have a whole city of fantastic gems, you know, but they didn't really solve the problem of that problem. But essentially, I think that I'm not afraid of chaos. I mean, in general, I'm not afraid of chaos, visual chaos. I think that, you know, anybody who's really afraid of chaos shouldn't, for instance, be living around here to begin with. There are places where people who are psychologically disturbed, and I can understand how a lot of people would be psychologically disturbed by chaos. You know, there are places that you can live, you know, away from chaos. And I think that, but basically I'm a real believer in coexistence, and I think in a lot of ways coexistence works in LA on some levels visually. I think that in some places, you know, it just kind of forms a texture, and an individual deciding that he's going to paint the front color of his place a certain color, you know, even though it's totally outrageous in relationship to what's next door to it, isn't so bad because 2 doors down there's something else that's totally outrageous that makes